Numéro 99 du Comité permanent des transports, de l'infrastructure et
I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 99 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Transport, Infrastructure and Communities, pursuant to Standing Order 108, paragraph 2, on the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, March 7, 2023. The committee meets to discuss on this study on the high-frequency rail projects and committee business. Today's business is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders, and therefore members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application.
Feedback events can occur. These can be extremely harmful to our interpreters and cause serious injury. The most common cause of sound feedback is an earpiece worn too close to a microphone. I'm therefore asking all participants to exercise a high degree of caution when handling the earpieces, especially when your microphone or your neighbor's microphone is turned on. In order to prevent incidents and safeguard the hearing health of our interpreters, I invite all participants to ensure that they speak into the microphone into which their headset is plugged, and to avoid manipulating the earbuds by placing them on the table away from the microphone when they're not in use. I'd like to now welcome our witnesses for today, colleagues. As an individual appearing, we have Yona Freemark, Lead Practice Area on Fair Housing, Land Use and Transportation, Urban Institute, joining us by video conference. Welcome. As an individual, we have Ryan Katz-Rosen, hope I got that right, Associate Professor, School of Political Studies at the University of Ottawa. Welcome to you. And from Quebec Employers Council, we have Mr. Carl Blackburn, President and Chief Executive Officer, joining us by video conference, as well as Norma Kozaya, Vice President of Research and Chief Economist, once again by video conference. We'll begin with opening remarks, 5 minutes each, and for that I will turn the floor over to you, Yona Freemark.
Thank you for having me here today. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the high-frequency rail project. My name is Yona Freemark. I hold a PhD in urban studies and have been researching topics related to transportation, land use, and housing for 15 years. I speak here as an individual researcher, not as a representative of my employer, the Urban Institute, which does not take positions on specific policies. In undertaking its rail project, which I will hereafter refer to as HFR, Canada is taking a major step forward in underinvestment in improving train service for the populations of Ontario and Quebec. This comes after decades of underinvestment. In my research, I have demonstrated that Canada's per capita rail investment has been the lowest of all G7 members in every year but one since at least 1995. In recent decades, its investment levels have been less than half and sometimes as low as 1/10 the levels of those in countries like France, Italy, and Japan. This underinvestment has consequences. Rail ridership in Canada is extremely low compared to that in other G7 nations, with the average Canadian taking an intercity rail trip just once every 10 years. That compares to rail travel in a country like Germany, where the average resident takes 25 intercity rail trips a year. Lack of rail system use, in turn, has negative impacts on Canada's society, environment, and economy. Unavailability of frequent, rapid, and affordable intercity rail access limits the ability of people without a car, with inadequate funds to afford a flight, or living far from an airport to move around the country. It forces residents to travel to airports far from the center of population, and the nation's dependence on flights and cars has resulted in Canada having some of the highest per capita transportation sector carbon emissions in the world, up to 3 times as high as in peer countries. And poor rail service has limited the ability of Canada's major cities to capitalize on the agglomeration effects of concentrating rail service in the country's downtowns. The government's proposed HFR project would improve service considerably along the Toronto to Quebec corridor, expanding options for residents of those cities and also Ottawa, Montreal, and other cities along the way. My review of comparable corridors in other countries shows that rail lines serving similarly large metropolitan areas feature far more frequent rail service than VIA does today, suggesting the benefits of such improvements. Those benefits would be particularly useful in the Toronto to Montreal via Ottawa section of the corridor, where flights currently dominate the market. Nonetheless, my examination of evidence from international examples suggests that the HFR project would fail to live up to the full potential of the central segment of the line, whose length and distribution of metropolitan areas is similar to those of the Paris-Marseille, Madrid-Barcelona, and Milan-Naples corridors. Thanks to considerable investment in high-speed rail infrastructure allowing travel at speeds up to 300 kilometers per hour, those routes operate at far higher average speeds than those proposed for Canada after the completion of the HFR project. This difference in average speeds is very important for attracting riders away from polluting, expensive flights. Based on evidence from corridors around the world, the HFR project may be expected to increase the rail share of the market on the Toronto to Montreal segment to between 30 and 60%. However, an investment in faster high-speed rail service could expand that market share to 70 to 90%. High-speed rail service would make most air travel from Toronto and Montreal to Ottawa superfluous. This investment could allow a significant reduction in the number of flights operating in this segment of the corridor and reduce carbon emissions in the process. I encourage the committee to consider the potential missed opportunity of not investing in a truly rapid high-speed rail service in Canada, potentially along the Toronto to Montreal via Ottawa segment. Thank you. I look forward to discussion with the committee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Freemark. Next, we go to Mr. Katz-Rosen. Floor is yours.
Much for the invitation to participate. It's really an honor to be here. I want to start by relaying a cautionary tale for how rail infrastructure mega projects could go wrong, drawing from a new book by one of the world's leading experts on mega projects and risk, Professor Bent Flyberg. In 2008, Californians approved a proposed high-speed train that would connect Los Angeles and San Francisco about 600 kilometers apart in just 2.5 hours. The project was expected to cost $33 billion and would be completed by the year 2020. Work began, but shortly thereafter it hit snags. Cost estimates soared first to $43 billion, then $68 billion, then $77 billion, $83 billion, and as of the writing of the book, one estimate pegged the expected full cost of the project at $100 billion. Today, the state only plans to complete the middle segment of the train line between the towns of Merced and Bakersfield. And this may end up saving the state about $80 billion, but consequently, many now dub this project the bullet train to nowhere, as the train will not come within 150 kilometers of either LA or San Francisco. So how do we make sure that high-frequency rail avoids becoming another story like this? And how do we make sure new rail infrastructure contributes to societal goals like climate change mitigation? I've been thinking about some of these questions for over a decade since I wrote my PhD on the environmental political economy of high-speed rail development in Canada. And I have a few ideas to share. My first is I would advise seeking political consensus on the primary objectives of this project and let those objectives guide the government like a beacon throughout. What is the main objective of HFR? Is it to modernize Canada's passenger rail system? Is it to ensure affordable intercity transport options are available to a growing population? Is it to reduce congestion? Is it to divert traffic away from more polluting modes? Is it to generate regional growth opportunities? Is it to help tackle climate change? Is it to reduce travel times in the corridor? Is it to support 21st century nation building? And so on. It's important to get on the same page about what the government's priorities are. Otherwise, there's a risk of project failure as the years go on and as political change inevitably follows with it. The inconvenient truth is that some of these objectives may actually be incompatible. So an all of the above approach response is unrealistic. Second, my colleague Professor Flyberg's advice is to plan out every detail before you get shovels in the ground. So think slow, act fast is the mantra, meaning take the time to thoroughly plan and budget everything down to the last rivet before jumping into the delivery phase. Transport mega projects, and especially rail projects, are notorious for spiraling into a break-fix cycle where time is diverted to trying to fix small mistakes that continue to arise as a result of a lack of planning. Maybe the O train comes to mind for those of you who are in the Ottawa area. Finally, rather than approach this as a public-private partnership or a P3, my advice would be, if it's not already too late, to utilize the existing structure of VIA as a crown entity to support the government's advantage. Keep the ownership and operation of the HFR line within the public sphere. This doesn't mean no involvement for the private sector. Rather, one of the three private consortia in the procurement process should be contracted as a master builder to bring the project to fruition, an entity with experience and a proven track record of success. I'm well aware of the motivations for seeking out a P3, chief among them the belief that costs to the taxpayer can be minimized by sharing the expense with private capital, but the scholarly research on P3 suggests the model could pose greater risk of cost overruns and project delays, and further limit the ability of the government to use the project to achieve broader public objectives. Failing to meet those objectives, in turn, could also translate into costs for the Canadian public down the line. In the interest of time, I'll leave it there, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Katz-Rosen. Prochainement, next, nous avons Monsieur Blackburn. Monsieur Blackburn, la parole est à vous. Vous avez
Now over to Mr. Blackburn. You have 5 minutes, please. The Conseil du Patronat du Québec thanks the Standing Committee on Transport, Infrastructure and Communities for the opportunity to present its comments and recommendations.
It was near the beginning. I was getting French. I was getting no interpretation, and then I think just as you called that stop, it started in English again. So perhaps if he could just start from the top, that would be helpful.
OK. On voulait juste vérifier
Bien
que
évidemment,
la
je peux
traduction...
So we just wanted to check that interpretation is working as it should. So if you would kindly start all over, you have the floor. No problem. As I mentioned, the Conseil du Patronat du Québec thanks the Standing Committee on Transport, Infrastructure and Communities for the opportunity to present its comments and recommendations as part of its study of the Quebec-Toronto high-frequency train TGF project. For the CPQ, sustainable mobility is an essential ingredient of our collective prosperity with its impact on our economy, our environment, and our society. It is important that an efficient link between Quebec City and Toronto becomes a reality to significantly improve people's mobility in Canada's most populous corridor and meet future transportation needs. For the CPQ, speed, which means shorter journey times, is clearly an important selection criterion for increasing the attractiveness of rail travel and the impact of the project alongside the fundamental criteria of reliability, safety, and comfort. The speed criteria is essential if we are to have a real impact on modal shift behavior, in particular from car to train. And remember that passenger rail service currently accounts for only 2% of all journeys in the region, while cars account for 94%. A rapid link would also boost trip volumes and attract new users. It would have several benefits. The first being to bring Canada's two largest cities, two provincial capitals, and the national capital significantly closer together, facilitate people's mobility for business, tourism, and other purposes such as education or personal reasons, increase business opportunities. Shifting from car to train would also reduce the use of road infrastructure and therefore its maintenance costs, and as well as reducing the number of accidents and collisions. On the environmental front, we must remember that it is essential that reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector is essential if Quebec and Canada are to achieve their ambitious greenhouse gas reduction targets. On the integrating a speed criterion which is not incompatible with a frequency would maximize the project's economic, social, and environmental impact. Moreover, in cost-benefit analysis of transport projects, which are a decision-making methodology used to assess the opportunity of social economic profitability of projects, travel times are among the main benefits.
Il estime également nécessaire pour assurer un financement durable de la mobilité.
It also believes that it's necessary to ensure sustainable financing of ability to inform decisions, to call for long-term planning, and to subject new infrastructure projects to an evaluation of costs, including those of operation and maintenance in the long term. We do not currently know the costs of HFR or high-speed train, which makes the exercise relatively difficult. However, according to experts, if international experiences are anything to go by, the cost of a high-speed train per kilometer or per passenger could be less costly than we think, and therefore be reasonable in view of the expected benefits and a real increase in the attractiveness and use of the new link. The cost could, however, hover around $51 million per kilometer. Based on a cost of 35 million euros per kilometer, or approximately 51 million Canadian dollars, for the extension of the high-speed train network in France to connect Bordeaux and Toulouse. The Quebec-Toronto corridor has demographic and geographic characteristics that make it interesting for a high-speed train. The potential number of passengers is considerable. It has already been predicted, according to two 2021 estimates, that the number of passengers could reach 17 million by 2059, compared to 4 million today. With a high-speed train, this number should be even higher. If we add the significant recent demographic growth in Canada, the greater awareness of environmental issues, as well as to new preferences for leisure, it is reasonable to think that the number of passengers and trips would be greater. It would also be important to promote possible intermodality with other types of transport and good integration with existing intra-urban transport, such as the REM, the electrical network in Montreal. The train will certainly not be able to stop everywhere. It would be necessary to ensure good connection with regional modes of transport. In conclusion, the CPQ supports a high-speed train project, which could also be at a high frequency and that would truly meet the objectives of sustainable development and would bring the affected cities closer together. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Blackburn. We're going to begin with our first round of questions with Mr. Muse. You have the floor.
Thank you. First, Mr. Freemark, and I know you submitted a very lengthy and interesting brief to the committee as well, so thank you for that. You talked in your testimony about you know, the differences between high frequency rail and high speed rail, and whether the speed was too slow. Certainly from previous testimony at this committee on this study, we've asked that question, and you know, is the incremental difference in speed in this corridor you know, worth the cost? And so I guess I'd ask that question to you and for your comment on that.
I think that's a very valid question. Certainly, the speeds that are being proposed for the high-frequency rail, at least as far as I interpret the current plans, which are preliminary, would improve the average speed between Toronto and Montreal to 130 kilometers per hour, which is not slow. It's certainly much faster than the current service, but compared to what we see in European countries that have invested in high-speed rail, it is quite slow. So just to give you some examples, between Paris and Lyon, the trains average 202 kilometers per hour. So it's dramatically faster over that distance. And between Paris and Marseille, they average 215 kilometers per hour. And that difference is key to explaining ridership on the corridor. So when we've looked comparatively across rail systems around the world, what we found is that there is a dramatic improvement in ridership once the rail service between two cities goes below 3 hours. What's currently being proposed for the high-frequency rail project is a service of about 4 hours, maybe 3.5 hours if we're lucky, to connect Toronto and Montreal. That is an improvement over the current situation, but it would not provoke a massive mode shift away from cars and flights like we've seen in corridors where high-speed rail has been integrated. So from my perspective, if we are thinking about the investment in the line as a once-in-a-lifetime investment, we have to be thinking about what it means to be choosing, essentially, to build a project that will intentionally not attract a large share of people out of cars and out of flights. And from a cost benefit perspective, that means decades of increased carbon emissions, decades of reduced accessibility between Canada's two largest metropolitan areas, and decades of congestion in the airports.
We asked the president of VIA HFR whether there was a business case and what the ridership might be looking forward, and there wasn't any answers, frankly. So maybe, I'm gathering from your comments just now that the high frequency model is not going to achieve that tipping point, as you say, 3 hours. That's going to increase the ridership and therefore have a business case. So it's really setting itself up for failure.
My sense is that the evidence from other countries is that the high frequency rail system could increase the overall share of the market to between 30 and 60%. There's a large amount of variability there because we see different outcomes in different countries. But if you were to move to a high-speed rail system with average speeds similar to what we see in European countries and allowing travel times of between 2.5 and 3 hours between Toronto and Montreal, you could see rail take an average of an 80% market share along that corridor. So there would be a much greater ridership response to that type of investment based on international examples.
Okay, I've got a minute left. So let me ask then, because we have a project proposed here that would be borne by taxpayers across the country and benefit, frankly, taxpayers and commuters only in one region of the country. So from your perspective, are there other areas of the country, whether it be Calgary, Edmonton, Calgary, Vancouver, are there other potential routes that should be looked at for this sort of a train?
I think it is totally reasonable to think that the Calgary-Edmonton corridor is also of potential investment worthy for the nation. It features large metropolitan areas, 1.5 million people each, that are located within quite a reasonable travel time. I believe you could have trains travel that corridor within 2 hours of one another. That would allow for 90% or more market share between Calgary and Edmonton, which would be a dramatic change given that there's currently no rail service, as far as I know, between those two metropolitan areas. In addition, the Calgary-Edmonton corridor has some advantages over the Toronto-Montreal corridor, just in terms of investments, because it is over land that features fewer geographic obstacles. So it could be cheaper to build per mile or kilometer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Muse. And if the committee will permit, I just had a follow-up question for Mr. Freeman. There's no objection? Okay, seeing none, Mr. Freemark, excuse me. Do you see the weather in Canada being a factor in inhibiting the development of high-speed rail versus high-frequency rail? Are there any examples, perhaps based on the information that you've been able to gather of countries around the world that perhaps have done this in areas, for example, we're talking about Edmonton and Calgary, very cold, lots of snow. Do you have any examples that you can provide that would be helpful in better understanding whether or not this is feasible in a country with a climate like Canada's? Thank you.
Certainly, Canada has some of the coldest weather in the world. That said, we have seen considerable investment in improved rail service on corridors like Moscow to St. Petersburg, northern sections of Japan, and parts of South Korea, all of which have very cold weather. Also, the Chinese high-speed rail network extends to every part of that nation, including large portions of the country which are very far north and thus experience many of the weather concerns that Canada does.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, colleagues, for your indulgence. Ms. Koutrakis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for appearing before Transit Committee this morning. I'll start off by my first questions to Mr. Freemark, and I think it's a great segue to your question, Mr. Chair. When it comes to the future of transportation and its infrastructure, where do you believe governments, regardless of the level, should be investing in regard to moving people safely and efficiently and keeping all of, climate challenges, terrain challenges? Where should governments be investing?
So from the perspective of responding to climate change, we absolutely must see a shift of people out of cars and out of planes. And there are some clear reasons for that. One is that there is overwhelming evidence that automobiles and planes pollute at far higher levels, both in terms of particulate pollution and in terms of carbon pollution, than do trains, especially when those trains are electrified. So from the perspective of responding to climate change, we absolutely must see a shift of people out of cars and planes. That is even true when we think about electrifying individual cars, because number one, that electrification process is going to take several decades to be complete. Number two, the cost of electrification is substantial in terms of the mineral resources required. And number three, you still have this problem of particulate pollution produced by tire and brake wear on the surrounding communities from cars. So all these issues together, in my mind, suggest that there's a real environmental reason to invest in rail service all around the world in virtually every country. I would say from an economic perspective, there are clear reasons to invest in rail as well. We have seen incredible evidence from all over the world that investment in improved rail service results in concentration of investment in existing areas like downtowns of our cities. And that concentration of investment is also good for the environment because it means less sprawl in suburban areas or currently agricultural or natural areas.
Also, talking about other countries, in many European cities, intercity train stations are just outside of the downtown areas, but they are usually very well connected to the transit system as a whole. Is that something we need to make sure to reinforce when the HFR project will move forward? And I'm just wondering if you can comment on that, Mr. Freemark, and Monsieur Blackburn aussi, s'il te plaît.
I can try to answer quickly. It is absolutely necessary to ensure that the rail system is connected to effective urban transit solutions. So, in the case of the Toronto to Quebec corridor, obviously Montreal and Toronto have effective subway systems and metro systems that are able to connect people to the existing railway terminus. But I would say that cities like Quebec, Trois-Rivières, Peterborough do not have particularly effective urban rail services at the moment, or any urban rail services at the moment. And so considering how those could be connected to a future intercity rail system seems very important.
Et Monsieur Blackburn, est-ce que vous pouvez...
Mr. Blackburn, could you please share with us your comments on that same question? That would be my pleasure. First of all, given the context of this investment, it would be a priority, I'd say, that the government is able to resist the call that all of the mayors will launch as to the project to develop a station. If we were to give in to that political appeal, unfortunately, we would not be able to achieve the objectives we set, that is to have either a high frequency or high speed train. It is key to put in place very strictly set out zones, as Mr. Freemark indicated, that is Quebec to Toronto, including the capital, including the major urban centers, and as well, in parallel, we need to develop secondary transportation methods that will make it possible to foster greater use of existing infrastructure. So this willingness that the government must have in order to prioritize these major centers is absolutely key when it comes to, first of all, making the project attractive, also to ensure that it is sustainable, of course, and of course, to ensure that this project remains efficient.
I have time for a quick question, and this question is to Mr. Katz-Rosene. And I'm sorry if I massacred your name. Can you clarify at which point do you consider the plane to be more effective than an electric train like HFR?
The plane?
Yeah, like oftentimes we hear that the competition to the train are the planes. So, at what point do you consider the plane to be more effective than an electric train like HFR, and also the competitive piece? And are we talking about Toronto, Vancouver, or are you also talking about shorter distances like Toronto, Montreal, or Montreal, Ottawa?
There's a lot there. Presently, air travel, if you factor in the time it takes to go to the airport, which is in Toronto and Montreal, not, in the center of the city, go through security, all that stuff, you're talking about a 3-hour and 15-minute trip at the very least, and then, meandering your way through once you get through the other side. And so I think we're looking at trying to achieve a train line that is able to be close to that in terms of it being competitive with aircraft. So we're looking at trying to bring the travel time to approximately 3 hours, 3:15, if we want to see people choose the train other than over the plane. But there are
Thank you.
other factors as well.
Thank you very much, Ms. Koutrakis. Prochainement, nous avons M. Barcelou Duval. À vous la parole, 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Barcelou Duval, 6 minutes, please. Thank you, Chair. Welcome to our witnesses. We're pleased to have you here for this important study. I'd like to start with Mr. Blackburn from the Quebec Employers Council. I'm sure you're quite familiar with Quebec because of your duties and your previous life. So my first question for you has to do with connection, because we talk a lot about the time it takes to travel from one city to another, whether you want a high frequency train or a high speed train. And people have asked, for example, if it's a high frequency or high speed train, if there's no connection from the downtown, for example, downtown Montreal, if you are in the north of the city, there could be a problem, because if you rely only on the amount of time it takes, the shortest possible time from Montreal to Quebec City or Montreal to Toronto, but ultimately the amount of time it takes starting from the starting point where you go to the train station in Montreal, and if it's in the north of the city rather than downtown, it could ultimately result in data being off course, because the amount of actual time used by people who would have to get to that downtown area is much longer. So if it's an issue for you, it's a matter of the connections. Of course, your question is a very interesting one, and you can see this very well. And thank you for raising this. We see the way in which one can develop in our territory versus efficiency as regards the actual travel time. So Mr. Freemark gave us some data earlier, which I thought were essential if we want to ensure the success of this investment, which is huge for the coming decades. We ultimately have to find a way to reduce the travel time to favor its use. And I would also like to tie things in with the other modes of transportation, because here I think that we have to look at the project as being a global project, which is complementary to other modes of transportation that we have in Canada, for example, REMs, and also in the Maritimes. And what you're proposing is an essential aspect for us to be able to reach the urban centers in order to have this capacity to enable users to prefer this kind of travel in a context where they gain in terms of time and efficiency of travel and using infrastructure that is already there. So of course we have to be able to place priority on those investments. So if you allow, we have Norma Cazer, our head economist of the company, that is aware of the different economic impacts and investment projects in certain areas. And I would like to ask Norma to also add some important aspects to the priority of the choices we have to make regarding destinations. Norma? Unfortunately, I'm going to have to break you off there. Maybe we'll have a chance to hear from your colleague afterwards, but as we don't have much time, I'd like to ask a second question. Right now, in what's being proposed by the government with the high-speed train, or rather high-frequency train, if we compare it to the situation right now, after that, with 20 minutes compared to what we have, or the high-frequency train, a gain of 35 minutes compared to the status quo. In other words, high-frequency rail in the Montreal-Toronto corridor, when we know that the travel time by car right now is faster than the train travel time, even with a 20-minute gain from Montreal to Quebec City, would not necessarily be, let's say, a gain that would make a huge difference compared to cars. Do you think that the speed gain is worthwhile to justify the investment? We put priority on a high-speed train, which would substantially increase have a gain in terms of the travel time. And based on the forecast on the table, it doesn't really, I would say, justify those investments if we don't aim to have a high-speed train. In some cases, it can include high frequencies, but of course, it's clear that we need to have a significant gain in terms of travel time. Perhaps if your colleague would like to add something. Thank you very much. Yes, indeed, a gain of 20 minutes or 30 minutes is clearly not enough to change the behavior and to make the train really attractive and worthwhile.
Vous avez mentionné aussi tout à
You
l'heure
also mentioned earlier the whole issue of costs, because this is an important aspect. Right now, we have a debate underway between the actual cost of high-speed train or high-frequency train, and people are throwing around different figures here and there, but we have a vision that the government has that we want to have a high-speed train or a high-frequency rail with sections that are high-speed. There is a call for tenders that was put out, and there were somebody qualified, but the government hasn't given us a number. But it's not really up to the public to make the choice. So what do you think about the importance of having transparency regarding the choices available so that we can have a debate within society? Because if we don't have the numbers, then it's difficult to do that. Well, first of all, the numbers are essential. And as you mentioned earlier, we only have estimates and examples of what's done elsewhere in the world. But it's clear that the government, first of all, is there to decide. So the government will make a choice of the options that will enable it to make the best possible investments. But in that context, we can draw inspiration on what's best around the world, and we have to encourage a public-private partnership. And we also have to have this investment as an investment for the coming decades. One must not look at it as a short-term thing, but rather for the next 50, 60, 75 years. And we will never have a second opportunity to really properly launch this project. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Blackburn. Thank you, Mr. Barceau-Duval.
Mr. Bachrach, the floor is yours. You have 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all three of our witnesses. I think this testimony is very pertinent to the study that we've undertaken. And it feels like the distinction between, or the choice between high-speed rail and high-frequency rail has been fairly well canvassed so far. So I'm going to try to focus on this question of public versus private procurement models and how that could affect the outcomes of the project. And perhaps I'll start with Mr. Katz-Rosene. I believe it was you that mentioned the importance of getting the objectives of the project established near the beginning. Of course, with the model that the government has gone with, this P3 model, one of the objectives in the mix is delivering profits for private investors. When we look at public models of rail development and private models of rail development around the world, what happens when private profit motives come into conflict with public objectives around transportation and the sort of things that we've been talking about at this meeting? What's the risk if those objectives come into conflict?
Well, thanks for the question. I mean, I agree that there are some real risks that come to my mind when I think about the possibility of this being a privately funded thing. And as you pointed out, a private firm has a responsibility, a fiduciary responsibility to obtain profits. And I see a couple risks there. One that's kind of well documented in the literature is a lack of transparency. If this is a government funded project, a public project, there's an accountability process, there's a transparency process built into that, and I think that's worth keeping. Another potential thing is, safety risks or other risks amounting to a private firm trying to cut costs, trying to maximize the value gain. And I think that's a real potential concern if we're having someone or a firm focused on maximizing the value, maximizing the return on investment from that point of view, and all of a sudden something comes up that might be more expensive, but it's the right thing to do because it's the climate-friendly option or it's the safer option, and all of a sudden that gets pushed down as an objective. And then one final thing I would say is one risk is that a private firm might want to see greater returns on investment quicker. And so we might end up seeing fares, the fare structure, the fee structure for tickets go up. And that places additional risk, sort of like this ladder of risk in terms of the project potentially amounting to failure because, they want to see greater returns. That leads to a higher likelihood of kind of tougher competition from other modes because all of a sudden, it's more expensive to take the train than it is to take one of these discount flights or hop in your car. And then all of a sudden the ridership projections that we have are not fulfilled. And that's a real risk to the project.
Thank you. Mr. Freemark, I'm wondering if you have examples from the international experience of countries that have successfully built high-speed or high-frequency rail using a public procurement and operation model. Are there countries that are building public projects and succeeding?
Yeah, so among democracies, there are a variety of approaches that have been undertaken in recent years to invest in intercity rail projects. So I think that my view is that there's sort of a range of approaches. There is the sort of United Kingdom approach, which has been extremely high cost, which is based on an almost private concession model for high-speed rail development. That was the process that was undertaken for their line connecting the Channel to London and now from London to Birmingham. That line has been quite pricey. I'm not sure that they have done a great job controlling costs. Then on the other side, there's the Spanish model, which is very much public sector driven. It is true that the Spanish government has done an excellent job through its infrastructure management called ADIF to restrain costs, and Spain has some of the lowest high-speed rail infrastructure costs in the world, which is interesting because it is true that they've taken a sort of purely public sector approach. That said, I do think it's worth noting that there are many varieties here, and I agree with my fellow panelist that the key issue, more than who is ultimately building the line or managing the line, is transparency and assurances from the government that the government is controlling the day-to-day of project design, planning, and construction. Without high levels of capacity coming from the public sector, you're likely to see some major problems with cost escalation, major problems with design changes over time. And so no matter what, I think it would be in the country's interest to ensure that it has a large number of public staff members, high level of staff capacity, working on overseeing the project, whether or not the project is ultimately public or private in composition.
My last question, I know I have just under a minute. Perhaps I'll frame the question and then come back to it in my next round. In my view, as a MP from a Western province, what we're considering here isn't just rail service between Toronto and Quebec City. What we're talking about is the future of rail service in our entire country, because Via Rail, our public passenger rail provider, currently derives 95% of its revenue from that corridor. And if it's privatized, as is the government's current plan, they're going to be expected to deliver passenger rail along all the rest of their routes throughout the country with 5% of the revenue, which to me seems totally untenable. So if the objective is to deliver passenger rail for all of Canada at the highest level possible, given resources, do you feel that the public procurement model or the private procurement model is going to do the best job or have the best chance of getting us there? And I'll leave it there. The chair's cut me off, and I'll return to it next round.
Thank you, Mr. Bachrach. The question has been posed, and we'll let our witnesses percolate over that. Next, we'll go to Mr. Lewis. Mr. Lewis, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that. Thank you to each of the witnesses for appearing here today. I'll dive right into it. I guess the first thing is, and I've brought it up to this committee before, I'm very, I guess, disappointed and or concerned that this conversation isn't surrounded more around Windsor to Toronto, at least part of the study, because Windsor, of course, next to Detroit, the busiest international border in North America. So that's nothing to do with the witnesses. I'm just making a statement because that's where our commodities come through. Mr. Fremont, I listened keenly when you spoke about a shift from cars and planes to trains. So this question is to you, sir. Ironically, I just looked up for me to take a train to Ottawa from Windsor to Ottawa, and it will take me, if I were to do that, 13 hours. And if I drove from Windsor to Ottawa, it will take me just under 8 hours if I only stop one time for fuel. And if I fly, it'll take me 5 hours. My question for you, sir, is with regard to the investment. Is there any way to close that gap, or am I missing something, or how do I best represent my constituents in Essex, in Windsor area, to ensure that the financial implications into it are going to actually have a result at the end?
You know, I think there's, I hear from your question and from the previous question, there's an interest in thinking about Canadian rail in general, not just the Toronto to Quebec City corridor. And I can understand that. Obviously, nobody wants to feel like the national government is investing just in part of the country and not in many other populous locations. And certainly the rail service from Windsor to Toronto currently and planned in the future is completely inaccessible to most people. It's way too slow. And the result is that the vast majority of people making journeys along that corridor are currently driving to do so. That, as I'm sure you know, the air service in the sections, west of Toronto are quite poor. And so folks are generally driving to make those types of journeys. It is also true that Toronto is a large enough metropolitan area that even though London, Windsor, etc., are not enormous metropolitan areas, the attractivity of Toronto as a huge population center could make investing in substantially improved rail service from Toronto to Windsor actually worth it. This is especially true if there was cooperation with the United States to connect into Detroit, but perhaps that's for another conversation. Even
Very
so,
well.
I think it's worth pointing out that yes, that corridor should be considered as well.
Okay, thank you very much. And I would like to open that the same question to Mr. Katz-Brezen, please, because I know that you touched on it as well, sir.
I was actually unable to attend because I was on one of those trains going to Waterloo, and yeah, it's a full day journey. There's a couple things I think you can do. One, we can look at improving the existing rail service, and there's some interesting ideas on the table about legislation or rules to prioritize passenger rail over freight. The next thing is, we can restore bus lines, coach bus lines. They are arguably one of the most climate-friendly and efficient forms of transport, and the coach bus lines have been completely gutted in this country, and that would be a good thing to restore. I think on your point, I agree that we want to see modal shift into rail and away from vehicles and planes, but those vehicles and planes are going to be around, and they're not going anywhere. And so I think while we also 100% need to modernize the rail system and focus on that, we also need to urgently think about ways, this is the Transport Committee, to scale up our sustainable aviation sector. And that can go numerous ways. You can focus on demand side mitigation. You can also talk about expanding sustainable aviation fuel production, as the Biden administration has done in the US. I know Air Canada has ordered electric aviation. We could be talking that supposedly these electric planes are going to be in service by 2028. We'll see if that comes true. This is short haul flights. So
thank you, sir. Mr. Chair, sorry, how much time do I have left?
14 seconds left, Mr. Lewis.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. Next, we have Ms. Murray. Ms. Murray, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes for your line of questioning, please.
Thanks. So this is a super interesting conversation, and I'm really going to be probing a bit more on the issues of cost and the issues of environmental net benefit. So thank you to all the witnesses for the information you've given so far. I was seized with the challenges that our government is facing with the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion project. In 2013, it was estimated to, and this is goes through some urban areas like Burnaby at a large infrastructure project. It was estimated it would cost $5.4 billion in 2013. By the spring a year ago, a new estimate was $30.9 billion. So that's between 5 and 6 times as much. And so it seems to me inherent in these major infrastructure projects that intersect with urban areas and deal with weather and terrain and so on, that there's a risk here. So for those that model the costs of this high frequency rail project, what is the risk that there will be exponential increase in costs compared with what's estimated at the beginning? And I guess, how do we mitigate that? How do we prevent that? So that's a question to Mr. Freemark, Blackburn, or Katz-Rosene.
You know, the issue of cost control, as my fellow panelists noted, is an issue for countries all over the world. Bint Flyby-Air has pointed out very clearly that mega projects suffer from cost escalation, time escalation, almost everywhere that they are proposed and invested in. So this is something that, I agree that we need public sector transparency and constant vigilance over the scale of the project and elements of the project that may be unnecessary or designed in a way that is inappropriate. I would say that cost benchmarking against comparable international projects is one mechanism to ensure that, for example, a contractor is not taking the nation for a ride, is not, charging too much for the project as proposed.
Are there other elements of planning that can prevent some of the cost escalations? And what is the time frame that one would expect that a project as envisioned today with a high frequency rail and or high speed component as well? Are we talking about 10 years before it's in service, 2 years, somewhere in between? What would be the estimate?
Given my understanding, so I spent a while trying to understand the government's proposals, which, as others have said, are not super clearly defined. So based on that, I would assume that there's going to be a number of years of additional planning. So minimum 10 years to implementation, probably more like 15 years to implementation. If you're looking at mechanisms to reduce cost, I would suggest that early land acquisition is one mechanism to substantially reduce cost if you know where the corridor is going to be. That, however, requires a lot of planning in advance. So I think a fellow panelist pointed out that it's a better idea to have the plans as well developed as possible from the beginning and then move forward quickly with land acquisition to reduce those land costs.
In terms of greenhouse gas emissions, I think it was Mr. Katz-Rosene that did some work around the impacts of train travel on the environment. And the quote I have in my notes here is that taking the train across Canada is worse for the climate than flying. So what my question, Mr. Katz-Rosene, is about is, given that this may not be in service for 15 years, this project, and given the speed at which our government is incentivizing the shift to electric vehicles, and the targets for phasing out the use of fossil fuel powered vehicles, are the calculations around the climate benefits of this high frequency rail, do they hold? Do they take into account where the puck is headed for in terms of bringing?
Thank you. Sorry, Ms. Murray, we don't have any more time, so I do ask that if witnesses would like to respond to that question, that they do so in writing following the meeting. Prochainement, next, nous avons Monsieur Barcelou Duval. À vous la parole. 2 minutes et demie, s'il vous plaît.
Over to Mr. Barcelou Duval. You have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is addressed to Mr. Katz-Rosin, and I realized while reading articles that you already published in the past, in which my predecessor mentioned that traveling across Canada by train is more polluting. And this shows that you've been focusing on rail transport for quite some years now, because this article dates as far back as 2020. You also mentioned the challenge of the public versus private partnerships to run the lines that will be the Toronto-Quebec City line, which my colleague would like to see an extension to Windsor, of course. Now, my question to you is, we have information that over 90% of Via Rail revenues come from the busiest line, which is the target of this project. Now, considering this implementation, now with a public-private partnership, now which will be completely independent from Via Rail, what would be the impact on the entire transport system of Via Rail? Across the territory, if we have the line that is most used, the busiest line, which generates the most income, which is under the control of Via Rail. My apologies, I'll address your question in English. It's much easier for me.
And I think it was Mr. Bachrach who pointed out earlier that, Via is largely subsidized in a way, the sort of non-essential lines, these coach lines that do use a lot of diesel, and essentially, I think there's some real risks to privatizing this line for Via's existing services. I think we want to make sure that these jobs remain within the public sector. I think we want to make sure that these existing services remain on offer. And I think there's some real risks of facing service cuts outside of Via Rail if this project fails. And so I think of it more in terms of risk around this project, this HFR project or HSR project or some combination thereof. And we want to make sure that this is a successful project in order for it to maintain the existing revenues that it can be used to support these existing services.
Thank you, Mr. Katz-Rosin. Merci, Mr. Barcelou Duval. Mr. Bachrach, the floor is yours. You have 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'll pick up where I left off on this question of the risk of this project proceeding using the current model, the risk that poses to the rest of Canada's passenger rail service. And perhaps the question is, if a private consortium can turn a profit by building high-frequency or high-speed rail, could not Via Rail turn a profit and then take those profits and invest them in the public good? Yes. Care to elaborate?
Yeah, I think there's some real risks to, again, turning this over to the private sector. And we have an existing entity. We have a Crown Corporation, and we can use that. We can use that to our advantage. And there's also a lot of real challenges or risks associated with privatizing that. One of which is that we've got these incredible assets, and how do we value that if we're turning that over to the private sector? So I'll leave my comments there. But yeah, there's no reason why a publicly owned line cannot derive revenues that can support the rest of the service.
Okay, maybe I'll ask Mr. Freemark for his thoughts on that same question around the national picture and how we structure this project so that it's really in the national interest, not just in the interest of Canada's big cities.
I agree with the other panelist that the decision to privatize profit and force the cost on the public sector inevitably will make the other elements of public sector provision more tenuous. So if Via is expected to continue to provide service without making profit from the Toronto to Montreal corridor, for example, then it's going to have more difficulties, especially if a private sector entity is taking up profit from that line. From an operational perspective, high-speed rail services in other parts of the world are almost universally operationally profitable, which means they pay for their day-to-day operations. That said, it is worth pointing out that that doesn't mean that they pay for their capital costs over time. So it depends on how the project's funding is structured, which is to say, if the project's profits are being spent on paying back debt service, for example, on a line, then it may not be possible for even a profitable high-speed line to support other parts of the country. If, on the other hand, the national government chooses to pay for the high-speed line with some dedicated source that doesn't incur debt onto VIA, then VIA could use its profit to support other parts of the country. So the key question is the profit sharing.
Thank you, Mr. Freemark, and thank you, Mr. Backrack. Next, we have Mr. Muse. Mr. Muse, the floor is yours. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. So let me ask, and I know we've talked a little bit about this theme, and my colleague Mr. Lewis, of course, talked about his experiences from Windsor. It was noted, of course, that the ability to connect into the U.S. through Detroit would be a great option for such a line. But I'm going to refer to an order paper question from my colleague, Mr. Ben Lobb from Huron-Bruce, who asked at the beginning of December regarding when there would actually be a final report on HFR for that Southwestern Ontario line. And, it was scheduled to come out in late 2023. The response with requisite excuses is that it will come out at some point in time in 2024. So we have already a delay. And so I guess I would just ask each of the witnesses, the ability of government to deliver mega projects on time and on budget, I don't think it's possible. So, what are the red flags here? What can we do about that? Maybe start with
as my colleague pointed out, the research on mega projects is, again, that's the mantra is they're over budget, over time, over and over again. And again, I think of it more from the point of view of which model is riskier. And we have some research pointing out that privately run projects and P3s, they come out in front looking like a cost-effective, a cost-saving measure, but often they have a higher risk of project failure, which means that government comes in afterwards and essentially comes in and has to pay more. And we've seen that. We've actually seen examples of that in Canada.
Sure. Mr. Freemark?
I would recommend that folks check out the example of the Purple Line, which is a light rail project in suburban Maryland outside of Washington, D.C., where a public-private partnership was expected to provide construction and 30 years of operation. That partnership just collapsed entirely and resulted in the project having 2 years of construction pause. The government had to recontract the whole situation, and the result was actually more money being spent on the project way more money than had originally been proposed. So this is not to say that a public-private partnership is necessarily wrong. I'm not trying to say that, but it is to suggest that there is no clear evidence that public-private partnerships will definitively produce a project that is cheaper and faster than a public entity would. I think there are examples all over the place on both sides.
Sure. And then Mr. Blackburn, or Monsieur Blackburn?
Je pense qu'on doit être capable de s'inspirer
I
de ce
think
qui
we have to build on what has already been done well in Quebec. We have a few examples, Autoroute 30 and 25. These are all private-public partnerships and that have yielded major results. So at this point in our process, we should not completely exclude the private portion. I think there's a good mix to be struck between the public and the private in a major mega project like this, and certainly that can give rise to very impressive results. And I think that we need to move to that exercise as long as possible for the common good of this infrastructure, and that's for the good of all of Canada.
And if I may ask again, Monsieur Blackburn, you talked about the evaluation of costs, and you said we don't know the costs. And I think you talked about the fact that we don't necessarily know the ridership. That was a question we did ask at the first meeting of this study. the incoming president of VHFR. So I guess I would ask from your perspective, is there a business case for this project? You know, and if so, what would it take to make it viable?
Comme je l'ai mentionné dès le départ, j'ai
As
pris
I mentioned from the outset, with me is the head economist of our organization, who unfortunately was able to come here, but I'll turn it over now to Norma, though, that she can bring some very interesting elements to this. Norma? Yeah, I believe that the proposals you have put forward, that is all of the three groups who have been chosen, will enable us to answer a number of questions. At this stage, of course, we don't have numbers in hand, but some evaluations are currently being conducted with two possible scenarios. One, 250 kilometers, one that can exceed the 130 kilometers an hour. So once again, we can build on what is done in other countries, what the benchmarks are. We've mentioned a number of numbers. The UQAM professor has studied some previous experiences. So always we have to look at the cost-benefit analysis. It's important to see an efficient segment between Quebec and Toronto, but I think a public partnership would make it possible to reduce risks and the risk of public indebtedness, and of course this carries the cost as well. So we can build on that. There are examples where it has not worked, other examples that indicate that it has worked. Thank you very much, Ms. Kozaya. Mr. Muse.
Mr. Badaway, you have 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to get a bit more granular with respect to the business of the business. So my first question is to Mr. Freemark with respect to the importance of aligning with all methods of transportation. Keeping in mind, one of the benefits of this project is that it's not just moving people, it's also moving trade on two separate lines, which will create more fluidity for both moving people and as well as moving trade. So I'd like you to comment on the importance of aligning all methods of transportation, including aligned service providers. So what I mean by that is methods of transportation, so marine, water, rail, of course, road, and air. So aligning those methods of moving both trade and people, but also including the aligned service providers in the individual jurisdictions. In Ontario, for example, Metrolinx and the intermunicipal transit systems. So Mr. Freemark, if you can comment on that.
So with regards to freight services, the potential here for freeing up of the existing corridor to allow for increased movement by freight rail could be quite important on the corridor if the passenger trains can be moved to a dedicated line, whether they're high speed or not, and the existing corridor can be dedicated for freight services. There could be a substantial increase in freight movement along the line. And we do know from experience that freight rail is more environmentally sustainable than trucking-based freight movement. You can also have logistics centers where you connect the two in important multimodal locations outside of the major metropolitan areas. So my perspective is that one of the key elements here is creating a situation where there's no conflict between freight and passenger services along the major elements of the corridor so that freight can move as freely as passenger service can. With regard to urban transit, you know, that was mentioned before, I agree with another panelist that one of the key goals here must be to ensure that the distance between the stations of the future line and the centers of population in the major metropolitan areas is as short as possible, whether that distance is reduced by improved urban transit or by having the terminus in a very central location, depends on the city, I suppose. But without that kept in mind, could have a situation where people are experiencing similar long distance travel to get to the rail stations like they experience with airports today, which would defeat half the point for investing in the rail service. So you need to get those rail stations in central, very transit accessible locations.
Well, all methods of transportation, whether it be intermunicipal transit, whether it be a train to a ship, if it's a cruise ship or something like that on the Great Lakes, or whether it's an airport, I guess what you're saying is that they should be in close proximity to each other.
Yes, that I agree with that.
Good, thank you. Second, binational, international. Everyone around the world is trying to be that destination to embark on. And this is a good opportunity for Canada to really move, especially people around the country with more fluidity. So how important, Mr. Freemark, and I'd like Ms. Nozaya to comment on this as well, how important is it to ensure that when we're doing the capital work, that in fact we do that not only with domestically, but we also include our binational partners across the border in the United States, but also really doing a lot of destination planning with our international partners. With that said, how important it is to begin investing first off in strategic locations, our capital, so that I'll use the word the hotspots, but also with that being done, also helping finance, as you mentioned earlier, for future expansion. Can you both comment on that?
So I can respond quickly to say that connecting with the Detroit metropolitan area is a huge opportunity for Canada and for the United States. The United States has also made major investments in intercity rail in recent years, and there's an opportunity to create a binational corridor of interest that could connect people across those large metropolitan areas. That could also be true going south to New York City. That would require significantly more investment from the United States, but it could involve some interesting binational agreements that could benefit both countries.
Ms. Kozaya?
Oui, merci. Effectivement, je crois qu'il faut
Thank you.
commencer par.
Yes, I do believe we have to begin with our large cities, Montreal and Toronto, where most of the population is concentrated. Eventually, we could also look towards New York and other cities. Because we don't have a choice, we have to reposition our logistical centers because of all of the geopolitical problems we're seeing right now are there, but we also need to strengthen our domestic markets as well as our North American markets. So to that extent, yes, this project could be the beginning of further projects that could be conducted with the United States, whether this involved New York or Detroit.
One final comment. We often talk about HFR and HSR. The challenge with this is that HFR sometimes is going to prevent HSR because when you're stopping more, that's more difficult to get the trains up to the 200 or 300 kilometers per hour. So what we also look forward to is that we're very strategic in having those HFR in those areas of which we've got to frequent, especially opening up the entire country to the surfaces, but also with those areas that aren't as frequent to actually allow the HSR to be put in place. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Badaway. Prochainement, nous avons Mr. Barcel-Duval. À vous la parole. 2 minutes et demie, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Barcel-Duval, 2 minutes. Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to come back to Mr. Blackburn. In your opening remarks, you indicated that what matters to you is that we need to, if we want to optimize speed and we want to put in place a structure that is being proposed by the government, is that we have to limit the stops. And that's a political issue. We need to stop the stops at every single little outlying city. I come from one of these cities and I don't expect to see these trains in my area, in my riding. But what I'm trying to understand is that the project before us, it seems to me, is a bit confused because we're a little bit in between. It's not quite a suburban train, nor is it a train that connects the main urban centers, even though that is how it's presented. When the government visited all of these areas, they went to the places where a station might be possible. And I noticed in Quebec that you have Laval. And I'm wondering if, when you look elsewhere in the world, are there stops in each outlying city in a high-speed train, or is there no stop in these cities? In a way, that doesn't make sense, but I'd like to hear you speak to that.
Effectivement, c'est une décision qui va être extrêmement.
Thank you for your question. First of all, it's a decision that will be very touchy, but it must be done courageously by the government because clearly the objectives that are being sought by these huge investments are to shorten the travel time and to favor a greater degree of complementarity between the different categories of transportation and to make sure that it can become a worthwhile competitive advantage. If unfortunately there are too many stops, then it's likely to compromise one of the major objectives, which is to improve the speed and frequency. So this is why it's an important exercise, and we need to focus these efforts on the one hand on the more populated cities. That's why the Quebec City, Toronto, including Montreal, and certain stops that are planned in the initial project are important. After that, with a greater linkage with what already exists in the peripheral areas be improved. Of course it could, but if we want to solve the issue with the initial project, with all the travel between the different points connected with perhaps political pressure, I'm afraid then that we would lose sight of the target and not be able to optimize that investment for the coming years and decades for Canada. Thank you, Mr. Blackburn and Mr. Basil Duval. And now we will hear from Mr. Bachrach. Mr. Bachrach, over to you. 2.5 minutes, please.
Mr. Chair. National governments have the opportunity, and I would say the responsibility, to plan over long time horizons, say 100 years into the future, while the private sector more often focuses on delivering financial returns over a much shorter time horizon. The government's current conception of this project is to have the private sector intimately involved in the design process, if not leading the design process. And my question is, what kinds of design decisions might be affected by a focus on maximizing financial returns over a shorter time period? And perhaps I'll start with Mr. Katz-Rosene and then go to Mr. Freemark if we have time.
I think for me, one of the main risks there in terms of having a quicker intended return on investment is the potential for a higher fare structure. I mentioned that before. I'll leave it there. For me, that's a real risk because once you drive up the cost, the number one determinant for modal choice for intercity transport is cost, price. So if you are trying to, and that ties in with HSR over HFR, because if you spend billions and billions of dollars on this massive project and you have a private firm trying to recoup those costs, you need to charge higher fares. And that is going to have an influence on your ability to take a share of the competing modes.
Perfect. Thank you. Mr. Freemark.
I agree with that assessment. We saw a public-private partnership for the project called Sud Europe Atlantique, which connects Paris to Bordeaux, that was completed in 2017. That partnership involved a private contractor contributing to cost of the line, but as a result, having very high toll fees for trains that used those tracks, which resulted in very high fares for trains that were using the system, even if they were fares provided on the existing public operator SNCF. So I also am concerned about the fare costs of having a private investor. I think that that should be something that should be considered seriously by the government. But I did want to mention a few other things that might be relevant to private versus public decisions. There's been a lot of discussion in this panel about how many stops to have along the line. I would suggest that one option is to have multiple types of services along the same corridor. This is feasible with multiple tracks. You can have express services, for example, going directly from Toronto to Montreal or directly from Toronto to Ottawa, but also have regional services that provide stops along the way. A private investor is much more likely to concentrate its services on just those that have the highest ridership, that have frankly, the most high income individuals that serve the biggest cities. There's an option to improve service also for the cities along the way. And I think that that's where a public investor or public interest can play a bigger role.
Thank you very much, Mr. Freemark, and thank you, Mr. Bachrach. Prochainement, nous avons Monsieur Iacono. Monsieur Iacono, à vous la parole.
And now, Mr. Iacono, you have 5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. And thank you to the witnesses for being here this morning. It's a very interesting subject. And of course, I would like to mention Laval, the district of Alfred Palan. There are a lot of empty lots there. And there was a question of having a station there. Mr. Blackburn, I'd like to go to short questions right away to give you time to enlighten us. What are the criteria to take into account to determine which cities should have stops for the future high-speed train or high-frequency train? Is there a difference between the two? Your question is a very interesting one, and I'll be cautious in what I may say in order not to engender a debate, but I think that the criteria of population and density is important. Also, criteria connected with the capacity for complementary development through other modes of transportation. If you want to have an opportunity to have a major transformational project that will maximize the use of the different sources of transportation and also make it possible to make these modes maximize in connection with the supply chains and population. I think that the two major criteria, the population and including density, and the best place to use all the different modes of transportation. Thank you. My next question may seem repetitive, but it focuses on a slightly different aspect. In your opinion, what criteria should be taken into account to determine where the stations should be placed within those cities chosen for the future high-speed or high-frequency train? These are the small details of project implementation, but the good news is that we have a new government organization with a new board of directors and new leadership that has been created that have all the necessary resources to properly evaluate the different options on the table. Of course, cost is one, efficiency is another, travel time is another aspect. I would tend to arrange it so that this new government-owned corporation that's managed by a new CEO who has a free hand for the objectives pursued by the government has the ability, better than anyone else, to come out with much more accurate answers based on certain criteria and indicators, which in the current criteria we do not have. What advantage does the high-speed train offer compared to a high-frequency train? Apologies. Go ahead. Well, first of all, I think that the main difference is the speed of travel. We see that with the high-speed train, with different simulations, there are substantial gains. And if one wants to foster greater use, then those substantial gains for consumers need to be attractive. If not, then it's not going to switch people over to that mode of transportation if we don't have a gain in terms of time and travel. So you think the most important thing is to focus more on the speed and not so much on the ridership or the use of the train, because a high-frequency train would have greater availability. It would be closer to the cities or communities. On the other hand, a high-speed train would be farther away from people. One doesn't necessarily contradict the other. You have to keep that in mind as well. But we see this. There are major gains in terms of travel between a high-speed or a high-frequency train. Earlier, I don't remember who made the comparison of the travel in their district towards Toronto or towards Ottawa, but if I want to take the train from Laval to Montreal, it'll take 10 hours by train and 4.5 hours by car. So to me, my behavior will not be changed by that investment because there's no gain there. That's the important thing to take into consideration if you want to maximize it and foster greater use. So it's the rapidity. If we have a high-speed train, then the station would be in Montreal. So all the people up in the north, such as myself, would have to travel down to the downtown Montreal in order to take the train. For example, a high-frequency train will make it possible for me to have a train station in the northern part of the urban area in Laval, which would serve the northern part of that region. My last question, what problems are raised by the placing in service of a high-speed train between Toronto and Quebec City? When you mention what are the problems, sir, are you talking about policy, infrastructure? What types of problems are you looking for? I'll leave it up to you to choose. First of all, we can see the political exercise with the example that you just gave in your writing, which is a risk that could involve major problems. The other risk, of course, is the financial cost. And what would be the project? Which project would maximize the financial investment and at the same time ensure that there is a real change in ridership behavior? And this is where the exercise is very important. I think that it's part of the main issues, I would say. Just to share with you, my colleagues from Laval, we have 4. I'm the only one who takes the train. For the other 3 is too far for them. So you have a community travel that fosters better use of collective transit. Thank you, Mr. Blackburn and Mr. Iacono. And to wind up today, we have Ms. Koutrakis. Ms. Koutrakis, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to move at this point that my motion to study tourism and transport, which was circulated and put on notice on December 12th, 2023, in both official languages, and I will read it into the record, if I may. That pursuant to Standing Order 108-2, the committee undertake a study examining the role of the transportation sector in the support and growth of the tourism industry in Canada, examining the challenges and opportunities that the transportation sector presents to tourism. That the committee invite witnesses with specific knowledge about the transportation sectors and the tourism sectors across the country. That the committee allocate a minimum of 5 meetings to this study. That the committee report its findings and actionable recommendations to the House, and that pursuant to Standing Order 109, the government table a comprehensive response.
Thank you very much, Ms. Koutrakis. Would you like to speak to the motion?
Yes, I would, very briefly. Thank you. As we all know, Mr. Chair, tourism is an integral part of the Canadian economy. It generates benefits across the country, rural and remote areas, Indigenous communities, and the North. Most critically, I wanted to share some of the numbers that make this study, I think, all the more important. 623,000 jobs in Canada, and these are 2022 numbers, directly attributable to tourism. 232,000 businesses. The vast majority were small and mid-sized enterprises, and which directly supported by the visitor economy. And this is as of June 2023. 18% of the transportation industries was supported by tourism jobs. And in Q3 2023, tourism contributed $6.9 billion in additional GDP to Canada's transportation sector. We all know that transportation is always an integral part and a key part of the tourist experience. But the lack of access, and we've heard this time and time again during various testimony that we've heard before us so far at the committee, and it reduced transport connectivity remains an issue for tourism operators. So for all of those reasons, Mr. Chair, I think this is an important study to be placed in the queue.
Thank you very much, Ms. Koutrakis. Before we dive into debate, because I see Mr. Muse has his hands up, would I have unanimous consent to ask that the witnesses be excused with our gratitude for their testimony today?
Thank you.
I see unanimous consent. Donc, un gros merci à vous toutes et à vous tous pour votre.
I wish to thank you, witnesses, for your comments today.
You're here in person. Merci. Mr.
Merci
Muse,
à
I'll
vous.
turn the floor over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. And, you know, I think we had our discussion at a previous meeting that there's the rotation of studies, and I like this study. This is, I think, for the statistics that Ms. Koutrakis just indicated. You know, it was 600,000 jobs and 232,000 businesses, and of course the transportation aspect of that, which I was not aware of that degree, 18% and 6.9 billion. So, two suggestions. You know, one is a bit more of a. You know, we get into wordsmithing, and we usually depend upon Mr. Bachrach for that. But you know, rather than a minimum of 5 meetings, we say up to 5 meetings. So that's more. But I. Oh, he's not here. He's here with his tie. And then I think that the study would actually benefit, given the volume of GDP that was mentioned, from the inclusion of the Minister of Transport and the Minister of Tourism as well to the study, in amongst the list of witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Muse. Turn it over to Ms. Koutrakis.
I'm amenable to those changes. That sounds fair to me. I think the importance is to do this study because it is a very important one.
Thank you, Ms. Koutrakis and Mr. Muse. I don't see anybody else on the speakers list, so perhaps we'll go to a vote. All those in favor of adopting the motion as amended by Mr. Muse?
Are we going to vote on the amendment first?
Oh,
yeah, I mean, there was a formal,
yeah,
there was
so
amendment sent around. I mean,
it was a friendly amendment, but regardless, I think
You want to just ask for unanimous consent?
unanimous
for the
consent to approve the motion as amended. Seeing no objection, the motion is adopted. Thank you, Ms. Koutrakis. Colleagues, before we conclude for today, we did discuss in previous meetings the possibility of a travel submission budget for upcoming studies. The deadline would be next week, next Friday, February 16th, and therefore I'd like to ask for unanimous consent, in fact, to go into committee business in camera for us to briefly discuss that and perhaps put ideas forward so that the clerk, if we decide to as a committee, submits such a request would have the time to be able to put all of that together on our behalf. Do I have unanimous consent? Seeing no objection, we'll now go in camera and we'll give the clerk a couple of minutes to be able to do that. The meeting is suspended.